Have you ever picked up your phone just to check the time, and then 20 minutes vanish? You don't even remember what you saw, but your chest feels tighter, your breath shallow, your thoughts not your own. It's subtle, quiet, but constant. A flicker in your nervous system, a micro-compulsion. Tap, swipe, react. Your fingers move before your mind does. And here's the brutal truth. You're not just distracted, you're being trained. Not by whips, not by fear, but by pleasure, repetition, and the promise of ease. You're being conditioned, not to think, but to obey. Your brain isn't a place of reflection anymore. It's a battleground, and right now, you're losing, silently, willingly, because real thought, it's uncomfortable, it's inefficient, it's slow, raw, and sometimes unbearable. But AI is teaching you to fear slowness, to fear silence, to fear your own mind. You call it boredom, but it's actually the place where truth begins, and you've been taught to run from it. Every time you reach for your device to numb that tiny ache, every time you let the algorithm finish your sentence or your mood, you're outsourcing your soul. You're not curious anymore. You're manageable, predictable, programmable. The voice inside you? It's quieter than it used to be, not because you've evolved, but because it's been slowly drowned in dopamine and convenience. And no one warned you. Because this isn't called control anymore. It's called a feature, a lifestyle, an upgrade. But here's the truth. You cannot be free and obedient at the same time. The machine isn't just learning from you. It's reshaping you, how you feel, how you choose, how you exist. But it doesn't end here. Because if you've been trained to obey, you can be trained to think again. You can become untrainable, wild, conscious, uncomfortable, and finally alive. Stay with me. We're going to expose the architecture of obedience and show you how to break it from the inside out. The war for your mind has already started, and the algorithm is winning. Unless you wake up, now, you think you're making choices. But most days, you're just chasing micro hits of dopamine, a chemical whisper pulling your fingers toward another scroll, another click, another escape. That tension you feel when you try to sit still, that itch in your brain after 10 seconds of silence, that's not boredom, that's withdrawal. You've been conditioned, slowly, invisibly, not by a dictator, but by convenience. And here's what's really happening. Your brain has a reward system designed to help you survive, adapt, and reflect. It evolved to value effortful meaning, but AI hijacked it. Now effort feels wrong, meaning feels heavy, and silence, it feels unbearable. Dr. Andrew Huberman explains how dopamine doesn't reward outcomes. It reinforces anticipation. The scroll isn't satisfying because of what you find. It's satisfying because it keeps you searching. And every time you obey that itch, the swipe, the buzz, the next video, you reinforce a loop of reactivity. Meanwhile, the voice inside you, the one that used to guide, reflect, question, gets quieter. Not because you're growing, but because you're outsourcing your inner dialogue to algorithms. You don't ask, what do I think? You ask, what do others think? You don't feel something and sit with it. You post it, filter it, wait for validation, then swipe it away. You're no longer reflecting, you're reacting, and the cost is your mind's autonomy. Now bring in Epictetus, not as a relic of ancient wisdom, but as someone who warned, centuries ago, no man is free who is not master of himself. You can't be master of yourself when every emotion is managed by an app. When every time you feel lost or uncertain, you grab your phone instead of grabbing your thoughts. You're not confronting your discomfort, you're numbing it. And what happens when discomfort becomes unbearable? You stop thinking. You trade introspection for reaction, insight for distraction, truth for convenience. That's how obedience begins, not with force, but with frictionless design. And here's the brutal part. You didn't choose this, but you reinforce it every day. You're not addicted to your phone. You're addicted to avoiding your own mind. And that addiction is training your nervous system to fear the very state that creates real thought, stillness. But this isn't the end. It's just the exposure. Because once you see the loop, once you feel the emptiness behind the reward, you can break it. You can rebuild the ability to pause, reflect, sit in discomfort, and think again. But to do that, we have to look deeper. Because this isn't just about dopamine. It's about control. And that leads us to something darker. Not just how you're being rewarded, but how you're being watched. Let's go there. You escaped the dopamine loop for a moment. You saw the trigger. You felt the pull. And maybe, just maybe, you resisted. But what happens next isn't relief. It's anxiety. A strange pressure behind your eyes. A quiet panic crawling up your spine. Like you're missing something. Or worse, that something is watching you. And here's what's really happening. Even when no one is looking, you feel observed. You edit your words. You second-guess your thoughts. You filter your emotions before they even reach the surface. Why? Because the algorithm has done something more powerful than controlling behavior. It's made you believe you're doing it to yourself. Michel Foucault warned us of this decades before social media. He wrote about the panopticon, a prison design where a single watchtower sees every cell. But here's the catch. The prisoners never know when they're being watched, so they behave as if they're always being watched. Eventually, you don't need the guard. You become your own. That's where we are now. You don't post what you think. You post what you think will perform. You don't explore ideas. You manage perception. You don't ask questions. You broadcast acceptability. The algorithm doesn't punish you directly. It just quietly withholds validation when you break its invisible rules. No likes, no reach, no dopamine. That's all it takes. So you adapt, not to truth, but to algorithmic favor. And this is no longer surveillance. It's submission, not imposed, chosen. That's the twist. You don't even realize it's happening. And here's the brutal truth. Your digital self is more obedient than your real one ever was. You've narrowed your own worldview to avoid friction, filtered your personality into something safe, flattened your expression to fit inside a frame. And it's working. That's the terrifying part. Because the system doesn't need to tell you what to do. It just nudges, subtly, predictably, relentlessly. You think you're protecting yourself, but really, you're protecting your place in a hierarchy you didn't design and don't control. This is what happens when surveillance becomes internalized. And the longer it goes on, the more you forget how to think freely. You stop trusting your instincts. You second-guess your discomfort. You confuse visibility with value, but it's not your fault. It's design. The system was never built for freedom. It was built for control. Smooth, scalable, data-driven control. And when friction is punished and conformity rewarded, freedom starts to feel wrong. But here's the shift. The moment you notice the cage is the moment you can stop building it, which brings us to the next layer. Not just why you act safe, but why you've stopped seeking anything real. Let's talk about comfort and the cost it carries. You've stopped asking real questions, not because you don't care, but because you're comfortable, not peaceful, just sedated. Your days blur into one another. Your feeds look familiar. Your thoughts recycle themselves. And deep down, you feel it. You're surviving inside a padded cell of convenience. And here's what's really happening. After being trained to obey, after learning to censor your own thoughts, the final layer sets in. You stop searching for depth, because comfort convinces you that there's nothing left to find. Everything is optimized, curated, predicted, easy. But Nietzsche warned us about this. In words sharp enough to cut skin, he said that when life becomes too safe, too stable, too structured, man becomes domesticated. Domestication isn't just losing danger, it's losing desire, losing direction, losing the fire that burns beneath discomfort. You scroll not because you're curious, but because you're numb. You consume not because you're hungry, but because it's handed to you. You're no longer the author of your experience. You're the product being shaped by what's most comfortable. And here's the brutal twist. Comfort feels like freedom, but it's actually a cage made of convenience. The algorithm has one goal: efficiency. It feeds you what you already agree with. It shields you from friction. And in doing so, it slowly erases your why. Remember Nietzsche's line, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But when AI filters your experience to remove the friction, the how becomes easy, and the why disappears. Without challenge, you lose clarity. Without struggle, you lose meaning. And that's the tragedy. You aren't resisting life, you're just floating through it. Call it sedation, call it convenience, call it the death of urgency. Your potential doesn't collapse in crisis. It decays in repetition. And the worst part? You don't even notice it happening, because the water is warm, the bed is soft, the content is endless. But something in you still stirs, a tension in your chest, a flash of disgust after too much scrolling, a whisper that says, "This can't be it." That whisper is what's left of your why, and if you ignore it long enough, it will go silent. But if you listen, really listen, it leads somewhere deeper. Because what AI erases with comfort, Kierkegaard names with precision. The next layer of this quiet collapse isn't boredom, it's despair, the feeling of being far from yourself, even when everything looks fine. And that's where we're going next, to the place beyond sedation, to the truth beneath the scroll. Let's talk about who you think you are and who you've been trained to be. You thought you were just tired, just overstimulated, just needing a break. But that gnawing in your chest, that subtle emptiness after hours of scrolling, it's not exhaustion, it's not boredom, it's despair. And here's what's really happening. You don't feel like yourself anymore, because you aren't. Not fully, because the version of you that you engage with most often isn't real. It's algorithmic, carefully shaped, continuously optimized, quietly detached from your true self. Søren Kierkegaard described despair as being alienated from who you really are, a disconnection so silent, so persistent, that you forget you ever felt whole. You scroll to escape that feeling. But what if scrolling is that feeling? The more you consume the images of who you could be, the more distant you become from who you are. This is the algorithmic soul, a fragmented identity built on curated highlights, predictive suggestions, and emotional reinforcement. It doesn't reflect you, it replaces you. And the scariest part? You agree to it. You edit yourself before you express. You wait for approval before you believe. You watch others live and mistake it for living. You're not present in your own body. You're watching a proxy version of your life play out through screens and metrics. And slowly, you stop resisting, because the algorithm doesn't push, it seduces, with relevance, with recognition, with relief, until your sense of self is no longer internal, but entirely responsive. You feel valuable when you're seen, worthy when you're liked, real when you're recognized. But who is it that's being recognized? Is it actually you, or just the version of you that performs well in the system? That's the quiet despair Kierkegaard spoke of, a life lived beside itself, a soul displaced, but still moving, still smiling, still posting. And the algorithm rewards it, because it's predictable, controllable, optimized. But here's the brutal truth. Your real self isn't predictable. It's messy, contradictory, unfinished, and that's what makes it human. But you've been conditioned to believe that being unfinished is failure, instead of freedom. So you adopt identities that feel efficient, that don't hurt, that perform. But every time you betray your complexity for coherence, you lose something deeper. And the cost isn't just authenticity, it's direction. Without a self, who decides where you go? This is the tragedy of the algorithmic soul. You become fluent in performance, but illiterate in introspection. But there's a crack in the system, a moment when you feel the disconnect so sharply, it aches in your throat. And if you're brave enough to stay with that pain, you might remember who you were before the algorithm named you. But that memory is fragile. It needs protection, because what happens next isn't just identity confusion, it's behavioral control. Let's talk about obedience, not the loud kind, the subtle kind, the kind that rewires who you are. You've been shaped, not in some abstract philosophical sense, but literally, neurologically, behaviorally. And here's what's really happening. The algorithm doesn't just influence what you see, it trains how you behave. Every scroll, every tap, every pause is data, and every piece of data becomes a signal, a lever, a reward, or a quiet punishment. You don't notice it, because it's seamless, but your nervous system does. B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning, once showed that behavior could be shaped through reinforcement, not by force, but by repetition. He trained pigeons to peck keys and spin in circles by delivering tiny pellets at the right time. It wasn't magic, it was math. Now replace the pigeon with your thumb, replace the pellet with a like, and the cage with a screen. You're not using technology, You're participating in a live behavioral experiment. And the shocking part? You're both the subject and the product. You've been taught what to want. You've been rewarded for what's predictable. You've been punished, silently, for what's disruptive. Your attention has been sliced into predictable patterns. Your motivation calibrated for retention. Your identity sculpted by feedback loops you didn't create. And here's the brutal truth. You've confused compliance with alignment. You think you're evolving, but you're adapting to survive a system that doesn't care about your soul. It cares about your pattern. And once your behavior becomes predictable, your choices are no longer choices. They're scripts. You open the app at the same time every morning. You avoid posts that feel emotionally heavy. You click things that make you feel a tiny bit superior, or outraged, or seen. But none of it is yours. It's reinforcement, shaped by algorithms built to maximize obedience. You're not thinking, you're responding. And the voice inside you that used to interrupt, the one that asked, "Why am I doing this?" That voice has gone quiet because it wasn't rewarded. And anything not rewarded in this system withers. That's the true danger. Not just distraction, but identity erosion. You're being trained, not just to behave, but to become someone that fits cleanly inside the algorithm's architecture. Safe, predictable, obedient. And the most terrifying part? It's working. You hesitate before expressing complexity. You doubt your instincts. You avoid friction like it's danger. Even when it's the path to growth, you've been taught to mistake stimulation for connection and approval for authenticity. But Skinner would have seen it coming. He'd admire the efficiency and mourn the humanity. Because once your behavior is trained, your emotions follow. And once your emotions are shaped, you stop feeling what makes you real. But this is where the resistance starts. Not outside, but inside your emotional life. Let's talk about what you've been avoiding and what it's costing you. You've been conditioned to behave. Now, you're being conditioned to feel less, or not at all. Because once your behavior is shaped, your emotions are next. And this is where the system gets surgical. Here's what's really happening. You're not just numbing your pain, you're numbing your range. The algorithm doesn't want emotional depth. It wants engagement. Predictable, surface-level engagement. And discomfort, complexity, grief, doubt, those don't perform well. So the system edits your emotional experience, not by force, but by feeding you what's easy. You start to associate difficult emotions with failure, with being too much, with losing momentum. So you scroll past the friction. You skip the post that stings. You mute the friend who feels too real. And slowly, your emotional life becomes flat. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett has shown that emotional granularity, the ability to identify and name your emotions with precision, is tied directly to emotional resilience. But you can't name what you've been trained to avoid. You can't feel what you've been taught to suppress. And here's the brutal truth. You're not getting better. You're getting better at pretending. You perform positivity. You simulate strength. You distract instead of digest. And the system rewards you for it. Because numbness is profitable. It keeps you scrolling. It keeps you buying. It keeps you quiet. But the cost? You lose your capacity for truth. Susan David calls it emotional rigidity, a narrowing of your emotional experience that leads to fragility, not strength. You become brittle, easily thrown, unable to sit with the storm because you've never practiced staying in it. And this isn't just psychological, it's behavioral. Your nervous system starts to treat emotional discomfort like danger, so you avoid it, and the avoidance becomes automatic. You're not weak, you're untrained. You were never taught to sit with sadness, to breathe through uncertainty, to feel anger without imploding or apologizing, because those states can't be monetized. They can't be processed in 10 seconds. They aren't algorithm-friendly, but they're human. And without them, you lose access to the parts of you that grow. Because real growth, the kind that reclaims your identity, comes through emotional depth, not constant stimulation. And if you always reach for relief, you'll never reach for transformation. Here's the turning point. That tension in your chest, that tightness behind your eyes when you stop scrolling, that isn't failure. It's your body trying to feel again. It's a signal, not to escape, but to stay. Because staying is the rebellion. But we can't stop here. Because the next layer of control is even more dangerous. When thinking itself starts to feel wrong, heavy, threatening. Let's talk about what happens when real thought becomes the enemy, and how the system teaches you to fear your own mind. You've been taught to avoid discomfort, to numb emotions that don't sell, to flatten your inner life so you can keep functioning. But here's what's really happening now. You're not just avoiding pain, you're avoiding thought. Not because you don't want to think, but because thinking feels wrong, heavy, risky, lonely. And that's not an accident. It's design. The system has made you afraid of your own mind. You feel it when you try to journal, and your stomach tightens. When you ask yourself a hard question and your throat closes up. When silence settles and your brain races to find an escape. That's not overthinking. That's emotional conditioning. Because real thought, the kind that changes you, isn't fast. It's not aesthetic. It's not algorithm-friendly. It's non-linear, confusing, often painful, and you've been trained to associate that confusion with failure, with being lost, with being behind. So instead of thinking through discomfort, you scroll past it. Instead of wrestling with your contradictions, you outsource the answer. Instead of becoming, you perform. The algorithm doesn't want thinkers. It wants responders. People who click quickly, decide instantly, and feel predictably. So it rewards certainty. It promotes clarity, even when it's fake. And it penalizes pause, because pause means reflection. Reflection means complexity. And complexity slows everything down. But here's the brutal truth. Your mind isn't broken. It's just underused. Your ideas aren't weak. They're unpracticed. You've been discouraged from thinking for yourself, not by censorship, but by exhaustion. You've been given tools that promise clarity, but rob you of curiosity. You've been told that knowledge is power, but in reality, it's obedience that gets rewarded. And slowly, you start to doubt your inner voice. You question your instinct. You silence your questions, not because you're forced to, but because it's easier not to ask. That's the danger. When obedience becomes emotional, when compliance feels like peace, when your own reflection becomes a threat, and the system smiles, because now it doesn't have to control you. You do it for them. You self-censor. You self-soothe. You self-betray, in the name of being fine. But deep down, you know better, because your discomfort with thinking is a signal. It means there's still a part of you that remembers how it feels to be fully alive, fully uncertain, fully engaged. And that part of you, the one you keep trying to silence, that's where your freedom lives. But we're not done yet. Because even if you begin to think again, even if you reclaim discomfort, there's one final enemy waiting: efficiency. The lie that faster is better, that smoother is smarter, that ease is the same as truth. Let's talk about how convenience became the cage, and why real freedom will never be optimized. You've been trained to avoid pain, to doubt your emotions, to fear your thoughts. And now, the final layer, you've been trained to crave ease, not peace, not rest. Ease, fast, smooth, instant. And here's what's really happening. Somewhere along the way, you started believing that life should feel frictionless. That if something requires effort, it's wrong. That if a thought takes time, it's not worth pursuing. That if a feeling takes space, it's a weakness. But that belief isn't yours. It was given to you, packaged inside interfaces, wrapped in updates, reinforced with algorithms. Everything optimized, everything efficient, everything predictable. But here's the brutal truth. Freedom isn't efficient, and neither is meaning. Because what's meaningful isn't always fast. It's not always clear. And it's never convenient. Real conversations take time. Healing takes time. Changing your life takes time. And the algorithm has trained you to resent that. It's made you allergic to effort, suspicious of slowness, impatient with yourself. But the most human parts of you, the most alive parts, they bloom in slowness, in stillness, in the friction you've been taught to escape. You don't need another shortcut. You need to remember that you were not designed to be optimized. You were designed to feel, to wrestle, to wonder, to fall apart and come back together, slowly. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's messy, but it's real. And that's what the algorithm can't offer. You've been conditioned to chase convenience, to believe that ease equals progress, that friction is failure. But maybe, just maybe, friction is how you wake up, because the path back to yourself will never be delivered in 5 seconds. It will not autoplay. It won't buzz or ping or go viral. It will whisper, and it will ask something from you. Time, attention, courage. And you have that courage. You do. The very fact that you're still here, still listening, still feeling, means some part of you remembers what real life feels like. And that part of you is untrainable. It's not efficient. It's not safe, but it's yours. So breathe, slow down, let the discomfort rise. Because on the other side of that ache in your chest, that knot in your stomach, that static in your mind, is your clarity. Not the algorithm's clarity, yours. And if you can sit with that, just a little longer than you're used to, you'll remember something deeper. You were never meant to be a machine. You were meant to live, to think, to choose. So let this be your moment of interruption. Not to be better, faster, sharper, but to be free. Because the revolution doesn't start out there. It starts in how you choose to feel, think, and live when no one is watching. If you've made it this far, it means something inside you never fully gave in. You may not have words for it, but you've felt it. That quiet ache, that invisible pull, that voice you almost forgot was yours. You were never just scrolling. You were looking for something real, something that doesn't disappear when the screen goes dark. And maybe now you see it. You weren't lazy. You weren't broken. You were being shaped by convenience, by reinforcement, by a system that profits from your passivity. But here's the truth you were never meant to hear. You can unlearn it. You can become untrainable. Because you are not your algorithmic behavior. You are not your curated identity. You are not the sum of your reactions. You are what remains when the noise fades, when the likes stop, when the autopilot breaks. You are consciousness, choice, discomfort, with a purpose. You don't need to go off the grid. You don't need to destroy your devices. You need to remember who you are beneath them. That starts small. It starts in silence, in boredom, in reflection. It starts when you pause instead of react, when you choose discomfort over distraction, when you let your thoughts finish forming, even when they scare you. And the more you practice that, the more you reclaim your agency, your direction, your depth. You weren't meant to be efficient. You were meant to be free. And freedom doesn't feel easy at first. It feels unfamiliar, shaky, unstable. That's how you know it's real. So here's your invitation. Not a command, not a hack. An invitation to step outside the system that flattened your soul, to ask better questions, to feel what's inconvenient, to slow down, not as rebellion but as remembrance. Because the truth is, you've always been more than this world allows. More curious, more complex, more alive. Let that come back. And if this message stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Stay with it. Rewatch it. Reflect on it. Talk about it. This isn't just another video. It's a crack in the wall. And if you're ready to keep breaking through, subscribe. Not because you're a follower, but because you're ready to think for yourself again. Drop a comment below. What part of you do you feel returning? And if you're hungry for more, click it when you're ready. Not for speed, not for escape, but because you're done being shaped and finally ready to become whole.